beneath the old willow tree. Pilgrim's Meadow is a sleepy, half-forgotten hamlet hidden in the remote hills of Massachusetts. Few visitors ever find their way to this place, and there is precious little reason to do so, since Pilgrim's Meadow, population 246, is in most ways unremarkable. George Washington allegedly spent a night here in 1779, but as of yet no evidence has been found to support this, and many believe it to be mere folklore. And it is maybe in the realm of fantasy rather than reality that the inhabitants of Pilgrim's Meadow are extraordinary, because they are, maybe for lack of actual events, remarkably adept at telling a tale. Waiting for the long, dreary New England winter to pass, they gather around a crackling fire and tell each other tales of hardship and heroics, of wargs and witches, each more fantastic than the other. Yet no story is more remarkable or more melancholy than that of old Man Gunderson. The Gundersons had, like so many others, come to the New World in search for a better life. But what old Man Gunderson had found was as far removed from that as could be imagined. The Gundersons had arrived in Massachusetts in the 1650s, and when old Man Gunderson married his wife Charlotte, he was a fifth-generation settler in the New World. Old Man Gunderson was proud of his country and an extremely diligent worker. Although the Gundersons had been fishermen for as long as anyone could remember, old Man Gunderson had taken a job as caretaker of Mr. Bloomsbury's mansion, located 5 miles southwest of Pilgrim's Meadow. The villagers avoided the mansion and considered it haunted, a lair for witches, and one could still see the scratch marks on the mighty willow tree, where they had tied up 2 unfortunate young women believed to be in league with the devil during the witchcraft craze that had swept this corner of the earth a mere 80 years before. And yet that willow tree was still standing and growing. It was the most peculiar of trees. The seeds of that gnarly old willow allegedly came from England, planted here by the first settlers on the very day they founded Pilgrim's Meadow. Whether that remarkable tale is to be believed is another matter. Even if it was planted later, the willow is still extraordinary in many ways. It has since grown to a proud size, far taller than common willow trees, but its most distinguishing feature are 2 enormous branches, almost identical in size and form, growing in opposite directions, making it resemble an elderly giant seemingly welcoming visitors to this sleepy corner of the world with outstretched arms. Old Man Gunderson was not a superstitious man. He had his wits firmly among him, and believed only in what he could see with his own eyes. And he clearly perceived that pruning the hedges of Mr. Bloomsbury's mansion was more lucrative and far safer than facing the treacherous currents of the Atlantic seaboard. And Mr. Bloomsbury proved a pleasing superior, if ever such a person existed. Few in Pilgrim's Meadow had seen Bloomsbury, and those who did told outlandish tales of him, as could be expected. The fact that so little was known about this man only seemed to increase people's interest in him. A wealthy landowner from Boston or New York, who was both an American patriot and a loyal Englishman, a devout pilgrim and a drunk gambler, a former missionary and an alleged murderer. But old Man Gunderson did not care about the village gossip. He received his pay on time, and the fact that Mr. Bloomsbury was never present only meant that he could take care of the mansion without outside interference. Old Man Gunderson led a hard and simple life, and he enjoyed most of it. His wife Charlotte was kind and caring, and rumours of a terrible mental malady that had afflicted all women in her family seemed to Old Man Gunderson as true as the tale of the two-headed wolf that roamed the forest of Pilgrim's Meadow each full moon. But all men have their flaws, and even in the midst of content, a nagging seed of unrest had slowly but surely grown in Old Man Gunderson's heart. He and his wife had wanted nothing more than to have a child, but as the years passed, that wish had become unfulfilled, and Old Man Gunderson had to come to terms with the fact that he might indeed be the last of the Gundersons. The big, wide world, however, cared little for the worries of Old Man Gunderson of Pilgrim's Meadow, Massachusetts, and while Gunderson was cutting the grass around the old willow tree on a late April evening in 1775, 150 miles east of him, under the same pale moon, more important men were riding through the night from Boston to Lexington and Concord to warn the American patriots of the arrival of the British redcoats. Old Man Gunderson had cared little about the upheaval that had engulfed his capital in the past months. He was more concerned about sowing crops and feeding chickens than about tea parties and taxation documents. For what it was worth, Boston was as far away to him as London or China. But do not mistake Old Man Gunderson for an indifferent man. The realm of politics certainly was not his, but when duty called, it was not for Gunderson to shy away from it. And so he left his wife, the mansion and Pilgrim's Meadow, on a warm June day to fight for his homeland. This, however, is not a story about war, and Old Man Gunderson's exploits in Long Island are better left for another time. Suffice it to say that luck was on his side, and he returned to Pilgrim's Meadow safe and sound, albeit tired, the following summer, exactly a year and a day after he had left home. To his joy, he found the place almost unaltered. War might change most men, but it certainly did not change this sleepy hamlet. Yes, the hedges were less pruned than before, and the beer had become even more expensive. But apart from that, all seemed as he had remembered and dreamed of. But when the forest before Bloomsbury's mansion thinned out, and he turned the last corner to gaze his home, what did his weary eyes see? There was Charlotte, his wife, waiting for him at the fence. Her lips smiled gently, and the glimmer of her eyes revealed only a hint of sorrow. But what was she holding in her hands? Wrapped in a woolen blanket was another person, just several months old. Could it really be? Old Man Gunderson was over the moon. Duty had called Old Man Gunderson away, but a man's duty is not just for his country. It is also for his wife and, now, his family, and he vowed never to leave them. Charlotte had named the little girl Martha, in honor of Martha Washington, the wife of their beloved general. Old Man Gunderson loved Martha, and he loved Charlotte, and for a man who believed only in what he could see was pure bliss. But fate is a cruel mistress, and although it cared little about the worries of Old Man Gunderson, it surely seemed to envy his happiness. When Martha was 9 years old, she was seized by a terrible fever, and despite best efforts of Old Man Gunderson and Dr. Pecklesworth, she breathed her last on All Hallows Day, 1785. Gunderson's grief lasted many a year, and he seemed to have lost all joy in life. The grass around the mansion became coarser, the willow tree more untamed, and the mansion fell into dilapidation that mirrored the state of old man Gunderson's soul. Only his wife Charlotte seemed strangely unaffected by the loss of Martha, which estranged husband and wife, and made a mockery of the vow they had given in more innocent and easier times. Old man Gunderson hence became a more solitary man, and he was often seen wandering the hilltops around Pilgrim's Meadow at night, lost in thoughts. His mind darkened, and the man who had believed only in what he could see was suddenly haunted by spectres in the forest. Yet old man Gunderson's sorrow and inwardness was only accentuated by his wife's increased joy and restlessness, and many in the village saw this as proof that the stories of mental malady were more than rumour. Time passes slowly in places like Pilgrim's Meadow, but it was not kind to old man Gunderson. He had aged before his time, and deep lines of sorrow and grief had buried themselves in his face like trenches, only accentuated by his silvery grey hair, tokens of torment rather than wisdom. He only rarely spoke to his wife, or anyone else for that matter, and escaped life and himself on his prolonged walks in the woods, seeing visions of loss and emptiness, where before there were merely shapes of trees and rocks. On a particularly foggy night, it must have been the year 1794, old man Gunderson returned from one of his solitary walks to find the path barred by a hooded figure. "Who goes there?" Gunderson asked, being surprised by the sound of his own voice, a voice he rarely heard these days. "Whose business is it?" the figure replied, a voice full of contempt and bitterness. Lacking the energy to fight, Gunderson stopped and replied truthfully, "This is old man Gunderson. I live nearby. I'm just a wanderer at night, meaning no harm." Upon uttering these words, the hooded figure seemed to wince, but regained her composure. "Do not return home tonight," the hooded figure said, purposefully ignoring to reveal its identity, "for you will only find misery there." Its voice was still full of contempt, but Gunderson also detected something else in it, something he could only describe as regret. "Believe me, stranger," Gunderson replied, "no matter where I go, all I see is misery, and home is no different." "And misery unites us," the hooded figure said, her voice now trembling, lacking any sign of evil. "Look, stranger, I mean no trouble. Let me go home. I am too tired to trade stories of woe with stranger in disguise." "I am a stranger to you, yet we are family." Upon uttering this last word, the figure removed her hood and displayed a long streak of silvery hair mirroring the moonlight. Stepping closer, Gunderson perceived the delicate features of a young woman, her face that of a cold beauty, one that had seen far more dark days than light. It was a face that looked strangely familiar, like a long-lost memory. "It cannot be," old man Gunderson whispered. "Martha?" "Come," the woman replied, extending her hand. "This night is our destiny, and many things will end. May the end bring us the peace we have so long desired. Now, do not be too harsh with old man Gunderson. He had not been strong in years. Life had given him little reason for being so. And so he did not insist, he did not shout, he did not ask the millions of questions that his brain thought, but his mouth could not utter. Instead, he meekly took the woman's hand and followed her. The hand was cold, bitterly so, and it felt almost like touching a corpse. Yet it was still the closest he had ever felt to another human being, since before that fateful All Hallows Day, all those years ago, when the sun was warm and the birds were singing. Hand in hand they walked to the house, that pair of souls united in sorrow. Old Man Gunderson could see it from afar, the old willow, its black features clearly visible against the pale waning moon, stood erect, its two sturdy branches resembling the outstretched arms of a giant. But on the branch closer to the mansion, where Old Man Gunderson had always wanted to build a tree swing for Martha, a rope was dangling. But there was no swing at the end of the rope. Moving gently, almost peacefully, in the night breeze was the body of the woman he had loved, in what seemed to him a different life. The little strength he had left disappeared, vanishing into the empty night. "Charlotte," his whisper barely audible. The woman let go of his hand, her eyes showing regret and relief at the same time. "I'm sorry," she uttered, "but I had to do it." Like a long-lost thought suddenly reappearing, Old Man Gunderson asked, "Martha?" "No, I'm not. Although she's the reason I'm here. And she's the reason your wife is up there," she said, pointing towards the lifeless figure dangling gently from the branch. Old Man Gunderson was both full of thoughts and empty inside. A fight was raging inside him, and he was losing it. There was too much to understand, yet too little to know. The man who believed only in what he could see was no longer able to make sense of the world around him. I don't understand," he stammered. "Who are you?" There was a long pause. Finally, the woman smiled at him faintly. One could even detect a hint of warmth in it, but most of it was pity and envy. Ignorance truly is bliss. Her resolve seemed to falter, the very resolve and determination that had haunted her dreams, that had moved her, possessed her even. The resolve of people driven by that powerful desire called revenge. Her one and only purpose in life. That goal had been achieved a mere couple of hours before. Now that her quest was complete, emptiness crept into the fine cracks of the walls she had built around herself. The fortress of will was under attack. Now her soul too was at war. But she was not losing it. Not yet, anyhow, and she knew, as painful as it was, she had to tell him. "It all happened when you went east to fight for General Washington," she began, her voice heavy. But all the pent-up emotions finally seemed to come to the surface, each word providing a tiny morsel of relief. It felt almost like a confession. Your wife was pregnant, and the dream you had finally seemed to be coming truth. But for a young woman struggling with the inner demons of dozens of generations, pregnancy proved a nightmare. With nobody around to share her woes, each coming day increased her anxiety. Anxiety turned to despair, despair to insanity. And when the dreaded day of birth came, your wife, awoken after hours of labor from the exhaustive delirium by that impeccable Dr. Pecklesworth, was told that she was a mother of two. With one child pushing her to insanity, what would twins do? Could a woman on her own, and one utterly spent by inner turmoil, at that really provide for two young creatures? Insanity is a cruel mistress, providing you with the urge to do something, while at the same time rendering you completely unable to do so. So insanity suggested a compromise, and your wife was only too eager to listen. She would get rid of one child and raise the other. But in her despair and helplessness, your wife could not get herself to wield the sword and pass the sentence. When she made her choice, God knows how she made it, who had to die, she took one daughter and cast her out in the woods, barely a couple of weeks old. But the child did not die. I did not die. No, fortune was not so kind to me. Instead, I was found by a tribe of natives who raised me in the woods, only 2 days' journeys away from the house I was supposed to grow up in. Time passed, and I learned my story from rumors and whispers, and the deep knowledge of a child betrayed by the person who should have loved her the most. So you killed my wife out of revenge? Gunderson finally asked, with more than just a hint of incredulity in his voice. It was all too much for him. Call it revenge, call it pity. Do not judge me too harshly. I was abandoned by my mother, and the same demons that made her kill me made me kill her. The only difference between her and me is that I had the courage to do it. There was a long pause. Gunderson felt like saying or doing something, but he could barely breathe. An invisible rope had been tied around his neck and prevented him from thinking clearly. He desperately wanted to do something, but he had lost control over his own body. Instead, he felt like he was watching himself, and what he saw was an old man, laden with sorrow, slowly sitting down, leaning against that old willow tree. "What's your name?" Gunderson asked. The only question he could ask was, at the same time, the most trivial and most important. "I don't have one, Father," was the inevitable reply. And with that, she turned around and walked away back to the woods that were her haunted home. Gunderson was too weak to prevent her from leaving. Life had taken everything from him, the daughter he loved, the wife he knew, and now even the only family he had disappeared into that unforgiving night. He kept on sitting there, still as a statue, until a slow thought started to form in his shattered mind. Having failed the wife he once loved, the child he could not protect, and not even being able to exert revenge, there was only one thing left to do. Like a puppet on strings, whose movements are controlled by an invisible power from above, Gunderson slowly and feebly stood up and passively walked into the shed behind the once well-kept mansion. And after what seemed like an eternity, he returned to the willow tree where so much had happened that night to complete one last deed. Like an automaton, he inched himself towards the branch where his wife was dangling, paused for a second looking up, but then moved on, not stopping until he had reached the willow's left arm. She should not see him like this. On his right hand, he held a wooden stool, in his left a rope that dragged on the ground. Old Man Gunderson summoned all the strength he had left, stood on the stool and tied the rope around the massive branch. "Come on, just one more step," he mumbled, barely audible. Placing his head inside the noose, he looked up to the dark skies, a sliver of light just recognizable at the eastern horizon. He breathed deeply and with a final burst of energy pushed away the crude stool The people of Pilgrim's Meadow are an unforgiving lot. Old Man Gunderson had never wronged them. He was always kind and spared a helpful hand, even when life had dealt him many bad ones. Even his death had provided the villagers with a grand tale to while away many a long winter's night. Puritan stubbornness and ancient rites prohibited a proper burial to people taking their own lives, and when he was found days later, Gunderson and his wife were unceremoniously buried in a cold, wet hole next to the willow tree. Until this day, the villagers of Pilgrim's Meadow avoid the old mansion and the ancient willow tree, and those foolish enough who do not claim to see a ghost haunting the premises. The ghost of Old Man Gunderson, silvery tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks and a bloody scar around his neck. The scar of a man who believed only in what he could see, and was tormented by visions far crueler than everything that meets the eye.